pathological pervert, an individual with a cold and calculating temperament. Other people are simply objects to be manipulated and dominated in order to achieve their aims.
He is the worst serial killer I ever interviewed.
He could look you right in the eye, and you know he wanted to kill you. And he'd smile, he had a smirk on his face.
He was such a mixture, such a hodgepodge of different types of deviants.
Cruel, inhumane, cold, and calculated as they come.
During the many hours of interview with Gerard Schaefer, he was always full of smiles, very charming, but I knew I was in front of the darkest of any abyss, in front of Gerard Schaefer. I had literally the impression of a psychological rape on his behalf.
What are you accused of?
Well, I was accused of, originally accused of killing 34 women, but nobody has ever managed to come up with 34 names, jurisdictions, or anything else. It's a false accusation.
And what is your conviction?
I was convicted of killing 2 in Fort Pierce. I was never shown to be at the crime scene. There was never any link between me and the people that were killed, except the testimony of the mother of one of them.
Stéphane Bourgoin says he felt that it was someone who was evil, because in his eyes you don't exist. The other person doesn't exist. The other person is denied their individuality and their humanity. This is a case of perversion that's rarely seen, thank God.
Gerard Schaefer is condemned to life in prison in 1973 for the murder of 2 young women. The police will later attribute a further 34 victims to him. But they estimate that he may have killed between 80 to 110 people. In 1972, Robert Crowder is already the sheriff of Martin County in Florida.
I met Gerard Schaefer when he was an applicant for a position as a deputy sheriff. At that particular time, he was a police officer in Wilton Manors, Florida, in Broward County. And he was looking for a job as a deputy sheriff in another county. And at the time, he had what's been described as an apple-cheeked, wholesome appearance, could be very pleasant, almost charismatic in the way he would deal with people, but later we began to see that there was a different face underneath that facade.
Schaefer moves into a house a few kilometers away from the sheriff's office. He seems perfect for the position of deputy sheriff. But exactly 28 days later, Schaefer makes a grave error and is unmasked by his superior.
I was home that Saturday morning mowing my lawn. Telephone rings, my wife calls me in, I go to the telephone, and it's Schaefer. And he says, "You are really going to be mad at me. I really did something stupid." And I said, "Well, tell me what's going on." He says, "Well, yesterday when I was working, there were these 2 girls, teenage girls, hitchhiking, and I stopped to talk to them and gave them a ride and tried to impress upon them how dangerous it was for young girls to hitchhike. There were a lot of problems they could get into, trouble, bad things that could happen to them, and they just laughed at it and didn't take me seriously. So I arranged to meet them today, and I was going to put a scare into them and show them, convince them that it's dangerous so that nothing would happen to them later if they would do what I said." And he said he took them into the woods and then told them he was going to sell them into slavery. And then he said to scare them, he left them there to sit for a while, and then he was going to come back and let them loose. When he came back, they were gone. They had managed to get loose from the ropes.
The two young girls in question are called Pamela Sue Wells and Nancy Helen Trotter. They know that they only just escaped a perverted killer. After arresting Schaefer, Robert Crowder wants to understand what took place. He orders a reconstruction with the two young girls. What he discovers chills him to the bone. Taken to the undergrowth outside of town, Schaefer decides first to gag the two young girls before attaching their limbs, putting a rope around their necks and tying them to a tree. And then Schaefer announces that he's leaving, that he has an errand to run, but he'll be back to finish the job. He tells them he's going to kill them, but first he's going to torture them. But in his absence, the two girls free themselves and run away.
The girls told me basically the same story that Schaefer had told about meeting and then being picked up the next day. And he had also, they said, had pinched them on the buttocks and touched them in other ways. I don't remember exactly how it was all described. But then they began to get frightened when he tied them up and then drove off.
Schaefer is then arrested by his boss. A new fact then comes to light that will unmask him completely. Two bodies are found around Vero Beach, in Fort Pierce to be precise. Robert Stone is the prosecutor at Schaefer's trial, which begins in October 1973.
First, we realized we might have a murderer. It was when some old man was going through the underbrush looking for tin cans, aluminum cans, and he found a bone that he thought might be human. So the police went there and searched the area and found the remains of two people, two humans. They found a skull and scattered teeth. And almost at the exact same time, the mother of one of the girls who had been missing since September of '72 was going through the county, and she noticed the license plates, so she went to the tax office to find out if the plate number she had, if there was such a person in that county. And in fact, it belonged to Gerard Schaefer, who was in jail.
Schaefer's apartment is searched, and what the police discover there is the final confirmation for them that he is guilty.
He kept souvenirs of all of his victims. And we found a little jewelry box that had souvenirs of several girls that had been missing in Broward County, which is a county south of here. And we knew that he probably killed those people too.
During the search, in addition to jewelry belonging to the victims, the police find photos that the killer took himself before and after the murders. As in the case of Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter, Schaefer uses the same modus operandi when he kidnaps Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. He takes the two young girls by force to the woods near some swamps that border the ocean. He chooses a clearing situated in the middle of the swamps, a few hundred meters away from the road and hidden from view. He binds them and ties them to trees.
He'd make them drink alcohol, try to get them, drunk, photograph them, and he'd love to see them urinate, and because when they're hanging there, that gave him a big charge, and he just wanted to do everything he could to humiliate the women.
The ritual is probably linked to the pleasure taken in domination. Moreover, the attack is usually done with a knife because then there's physical contact with the victims. So either with a knife or strangulation or even suffocation. So the victims are touched. And of course, he makes them suffer slowly. And the slowness is part of the ritual.
And then after he killed them, he would, you know, have sex with them as long as they were able before they started decaying. And then he would mutilate them, and he would masturbate over their bones.
What was characteristic with Schaefer was his accumulation of paraphilia. And what does paraphilia mean? Well, they're what we used to call sexual perversions. They're unusual erotic motivations that are not at all shared by everyone. In Schaefer's case, it was his excessive and very erotic taste for pleasure he took in his sadism against his victims. He was sadistic towards them by practicing bondage, the bands and straps that were found in his drawings and his actual crimes and at the scene of his crimes. But also he eroticized everything to do with fecal matter, that's coprophilia, everything to do with urine and urinary emissions, that's urophilia. He made his victims drink to watch them urinate, and he would photograph them, which is highly characteristic. He would, of course, get sexual pleasure from this, and especially there's this sadism, which is also an extreme and very dangerous form of paraphilia. And while Schaefer was accruing all this, he had a protective social facade, which made him a very dangerous individual.
During his trial, Schaefer avoids the death penalty, which is suspended at the time in Florida. He is condemned to life in prison. Later, when he is still behind bars, he is officially connected to 32 other murders committed in the area, based on proof found in his home.
This is the house where Gerard John Schaefer lived when I met him in 1964.
Sandra London knew Gerard Schaefer well. She dates him for a year, then loses contact with him and gets back in touch with him 10 years later when she finds out about his crimes.
He always had two stories. Basically, the one was, I am the greatest killer of women in this century. The other side was, I'm innocent, I never killed anyone, and I'm a framed cop. And it was a wonderfully memorable moment. He leaned forward and spoke very slowly as he looked into my eyes. And he said, you don't understand because you're not a serial killer. When he was convicted of the two murders, Robert Stone connected him to 34 dead or missing girls that they weren't able to bring a case on. In dialoguing with Schaefer about that figure, he suggested, or he didn't suggest, he stated in a letter in writing that, that his own number would be closer to somewhere between 80 and 110. And he said, he went on about this at length. I mean, it's disgusting, but he was saying, how do you count a murder? If you have a victim gagged and they choke on their vomit, is that a murder? If you kill a woman who's pregnant, is that 2 murders or 1? So he raised that penumbra issue on the actual count of actual murders.
Locked up in his cell, Gerard Schaefer takes his sins to an extreme and publishes short stories entitled Killer Fiction, in which he portrays his own crimes, using a novel as his alibi. The police also use these stories to connect him to other unsolved murders. In the 1960s, Schaefer lives with his parents in the seaside town of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He is from a very devout Catholic family. As a child, Schaefer begins to hate his father, who starts to cheat on his wife, while he maintains an intimate relationship with his mother.
He was allowed access to his mother's bedroom to sleep right in the bed with his mother up until age 16.
Sandra London also remembers an episode that at the time didn't particularly traumatize her. She was only 16 years old.
We find ourselves sitting out on the beach at night, huddled in the blanket we usually used to lie down on. Instead, we had it around our shoulders this time. And he totally broke down, and he told me that he had overwhelming desires to kill women.
In hindsight, Sandra London remembers years later episodes that punctuate their youth and that will enable her to make Schaefer talk. When Stéphane Bourgoin meets him in November 1991, Gerard Schaefer has been in prison for 18 years. He never officially confessed to his crimes, sometimes revealing an anecdote about the disappearance of some young women. He was content to play cat-and-mouse games with the law, who tried to make him admit his guilt. Stéphane tries a roundabout way to get him to talk.
While I was interrogating Gerard Schaefer, he was pretending to be innocent. So I decided to adopt a new strategy. Since he was on Florida death row, he was meeting other serial killers like Ted Bundy, the most famous American serial killer. I was selecting specific crimes of Ted Bundy, which were exactly similar to those of Gerard Schaefer. And you can see now how he's, in a kind of way, admitting his crimes.
Was he reliving all the time his murders?
Well, I wouldn't say all the time, but I took the... he told me that he had followed my case in the detective magazines, and that he had killed 2 girls in Washington as a copycat crime, so to speak, on the place in Jessup. And I think those were Ott and Naisland. And he would tell me that he took them up on the logging road and strangled them and had sex with their corpses, and went back and had sex with their corpses and cut off their heads. Like, it's a tribute. And I'm thinking, you motherfuckers that wrote that. I said, here's the guy who read it, believed your bullshit, and went out and did something like this. And now, he's like bragging to me. It wasn't exactly a brag, it was like a tribute. How many did you get, really, Jerry? He said 34. Did you get all of them? Yeah, great. He said, I'm the best. I said somebody like that, friend. What can you say? You're left without any rational response because of you saying it. And it's all bullshit. He said, it's not. I know. And he knew. Because he had lived it. And I hadn't lived it, except through what was written about me. And he was doing it based on what he had read. So he had 36. He wanted to be the best. And he was obsessed because they said I had 34. And he was afraid that I had ones that he didn't know about. See? And he was always trying to get me to say, no, that's all I got, 34, you know. But I never would say that. I discerned that he was concerned about the number. And it was my own way of needling him back by saying, I'm the best, Ted. You're going to fry, and I'm going to be here. And I'll be the best, just like they said. The number 1. Mr. Stone had it all right. The best there ever was. And you're nothing. And he'd just go crazy. Can't be. And I'd take out my little thing from the Palm Beach Post. I said, read that, man. Cult. First page. Palm Beach Post. Cult. I'm the leader of the cult. You know, can't be. He was a sickie.
Il y a des éléments de perversion qui sont manifestes.
There are certain elements of perversion that are demonstrated and connected to the pleasure he takes at certain times in telling his story, true. But at the same time, he wants to be better than the best. The perversion resides in the fact that on the one hand he won't confess to his crimes, and at the same time he lets you know that others aren't as good as he is, that he's better than others. And if you look closely, you can't think that at the point where he licks his lips, when he runs his tongue on his lips, he doesn't extract great pleasure from it, since at the same time there's a particular intensity in his eyes and in the lowering of his voice, which shows the pleasure he still takes in a certain way in reliving these experiences.
As with all serial killers, Gerard Schaefer set his heart on prey that was systematically weaker than him. Young women who are easier to catch.
According to the studies that have been done on serial killers, they're not courageous, contrary to what literature or movies would like us to believe, where they're either shown as courageous or extremely intelligent. Neither one is true. Serial killers are people who attack victims that are weaker than themselves. Generally, they attack women or young men. They're armed, and the victim is going to have a lot of trouble defending themselves. They don't attack someone who is stronger than they are. I'd like to point out that they aren't warriors. They're people who are often afraid of others and are actually considered to be nice people in their everyday life, probably because conflict is not necessarily something they find easy. They're people who are going to avoid conflicts with people who have a certain power.
On December 3rd, 1995, Schaefer is killed by another inmate who stabs him 40 times.